Good morning, and welcome to this important discussion brought to you by BlackDoctor.org and the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, a global leader in the fight against cancer dedicated to curing leukemia, lymphoma, Hodgkin's disease, and myeloma, and improving the quality of life of patients and their family. This is the second panel of our inaugural Men's Health Summit, where we have 5 virtual panels providing much needed information about men's health. Let's do a little word association. Take a moment and place in the comments what comes to your mind when you hear the words clinical trials. Were your first thoughts positive or negative? Do you know what clinical trials are, how or why they are conducted, or more importantly, the impact they have on health outcomes? If you don't know much about clinical trials, don't feel bad. I don't know much either. So we're in this together. The good news is that why we're here. We have some guests from our friends at LLS and Cedars-Sinai Hospital to help us understand what clinical trials are and the role they play in improving health outcomes. We also have a special guest to tell us his experience with a clinical trial and the remarkable impact it's had on his life. Our first guest is Ms. Leah Susmita. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. I have that heavy Southern tongue, Leah, so forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name. But in her role as director of the Clinical Trial Support Center, Leah supports the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society's efforts to educate and support patients and caregivers affected by blood cancers. Through education, advocacy, coaching, and decision support services, Leah and the team of 10 nurse navigators help patients and their caregivers navigate the process of identifying and participating in clinical trials, overcome the barriers to enrollment, and provide support through the continuum of their treatment and care. Leah is going to start this program off with a short presentation to give us an overview of clinical trials.
Thank you, Ellis. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here today. So we can go to my first slide, please. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk to you about really are clinical trials in general, not necessarily specific to blood cancer patients. So just to start right at the beginning, what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a carefully controlled research study that's conducted by doctors to improve the care and treatment of people with cancer or other illnesses. A clinical trial may involve a brand new medication that's never been used before, or it actually could be combining a couple of different medications that have been used for other reasons, but now they're going to be used in a different patient population to see how well they work. What's important to really understand is that clinical trials are the key step in advancing all treatments, cancer treatments, but all treatments in general. So anything that is prescribed by a physician, whether it's a blood pressure pill or a cancer treatment, at one point had to go through a clinical trial in order to be approved. What I think is important to really understand is that clinical trial participation for cancer patients in our country is extremely low. As you can see here, only about 5% of adults who are eligible for a clinical trial actually participate. That number is a little bit higher for children, somewhere around 20%. But there are so many challenges with that. First of all, the people that are participating in cancer clinical trials are not representative of our diverse population. So we really need to improve that. But the other added challenge here is that many clinical trials never enroll enough patients to actually stay open. And so
Mm.
that's an enormous problem. About 20% of cancer clinical trials actually close simply because they never had enough patients enrolled to begin with. So, we may be missing out on some really amazing treatment modalities simply because we couldn't get enough patients to participate in the trial. Now, it's much more complicated than that. The clinical trial landscape is very complicated. And I use the analogy of wanting to enroll in a clinical trial and actually enrolling is not a straight path. There are many, many bumps in the road, and it's very overwhelming. And oftentimes people will need someone to help them navigate all those bumps in the road. And so I'll talk to you a little bit more about that today. Next slide, please. So there are many risks and benefits to any treatment option. For clinical trials, it's the same. So, some of the benefits to really consider are that participating in a clinical trial means that you're able to contribute to not only the present treatment of a disorder or a cancer, but also to the future. Clinical trials also give patients the opportunity to access new therapies that the rest of the world or country needs to wait many years for. And I'll explain the clinical trial process and why it is so long. But participating in a clinical trial can oftentimes give you access to really new novel therapies. One great example, if you've ever heard of CAR T therapy, it's a very new way to treat different types of cancer. For many years, that the only way to have been able to access that treatment is through a clinical trial. Another benefit is that the drug or drugs that are being studied in a clinical trial are free. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about all that other healthcare, but that is an important consideration. Another benefit is that if you're participating in a clinical trial, you're getting access to physicians who are specialists in that specific field. They have extensive experience in that type of cancer. And being part of a clinical trial means that you're going to be closely monitored and have frequent follow up. So, for many people, that's a comforting benefit. It may actually be something that people don't really look forward to so much, but in all honesty, for in a clinical trial, you're going to be followed very closely by that team of specialists. Um, some risks to consider when you're thinking about a clinical trial are it's the possibility that it may not work. Now, this is the same risk with many other types of treatments, not just clinical trials. There may be the fear of unknown side effects. And again, we're going to talk about the stages of clinical trials. But the really important thing to remember today, if you remember nothing else, is that safety is the top priority in a clinical trial. Another risk is that there's a chance a patient may be randomized to the standard of care, and we'll talk about that. Those are phase 3 clinical trials. And lastly, another risk to consider is that oftentimes participating in a clinical trial is going to bring you away from home frequently or for perhaps a long period of time. And that may be a particular challenge if that clinical trial is not being offered near you. Next slide. So, when we work with patients in the Clinical Trial Support Center, we do lots of education right from the start. And one of the most important things we can do is really debunk some of those myths that are out there about clinical trials. And so, I'm going to take you through, the four most common. So, there's a fear that if you are being offered a clinical trial, it must mean that you've exhausted all of your other treatment options. And what I really want to convey to you is that there are clinical trials available throughout the entire spectrum of disease. There are clinical trials for folks who are newly diagnosed and have never been treated yet. There are clinical trials for people who have tried other therapies and either never responded or their disease came back. But there are also clinical trials for people who are on maintenance therapy or who are in remission and into survivorship. So it's important to take away the stigma of clinical trials must mean there's no more hope for me. The
Mm.
second myth, clinical trials are not safe and I will not benefit from them. As I mentioned before, safety is the number one priority in a clinical trial. It is a process that is closely regulated by the FDA in our country, but also the IRB of wherever the trial is happening. So, oftentimes for cancer clinical trials, that would be a large academic cancer center. And we'll talk more about that.
To help our people understand what IRB stands for.
Internal review board. So this is a group of folks at a research site who have to approve every aspect and detail of a clinical trial before it can even begin. And they demand frequent updates and data regarding participants and their experience. And whenever there's any sort of issue, the IRB has the ability to pause that trial or stop that trial altogether until all the data is gathered and they can determine that it's safe to continue on. So
Gotcha.
great question. Thanks, Ellis. Um, Another concern is that if I'm in a clinical trial, I might be getting a sugar pill or a placebo. What I can tell you for cancer clinical trials is no patient will ever only receive a placebo. What
Mm.
happens in a cancer clinical trial is that Sometimes, particularly when you get to the phase of clinical trial where one group of patients gets whatever is the best approved therapy, and the other group of patients gets this new therapy that's being um, researched, is that sometimes a placebo may be given then, but you're never ever going to receive only a placebo. That would be completely unethical. So, at a minimum, in a clinical trial for cancer treatment, you are going to receive at least the best approved therapy for that diagnosis, plus
Okay.
or minus a placebo. And so, lastly, and this one, pains me to have to say, but clinical trials are not free. So, as I mentioned before, whatever's being studied, so either a new drug or maybe a combination of drugs, or maybe it's a stem cell transplant or something like a CAR T therapy, that is usually free and covered by whomever is sponsoring the trial. But the challenge is that all that other healthcare, so lab work, scans, antibiotics, IV fluids, all of that other therapy needs to be either billed to insurance or paid for out of pocket by a patient. And so that can be a big challenge for patients who have no insurance or don't have great coverage. Participating in clinical trials can be even more difficult. Next slide, please. So I've alluded to this. There are many phases of clinical trials. And so, just to give you some background here, before we even get into these phases here, a new drug or a combination of drugs has to be studied in the lab setting. And in that setting, it has to be shown to be safe and to be hopeful that it will work before it can go through the rigorous process of trying to become a clinical trial. So, once all of that early preclinical testing is done and all of the paperwork is done and the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted with the FDA and the IRB at that specific site, a trial can become a phase one trial. Phase one trials are also called first in human. So, again, when you think back to what I was saying, what the preclinical testing was done in the lab setting, that's either in petri dishes or in animals. A phase one trial is a very small group of people, I would say around 20 patients. And the whole goal of the phase one trial is to figure out what is the best dose with the least amount of side effects.
Mm.
And so, in that group of 20 or so people, different groups of people will get different doses of this new therapy. And the goal is to make sure that as the dose is increased, the side effects are manageable. And at the end of a phase one trial, and this could take a year or longer, the researchers will have determined what the best dose is. So, again, the highest dose with the least amount of side effects or the most manageable amount of side effects.
Right.
And so then you can move into a phase two trial. A phase two trial are more patients. So you're talking more around 100 or so patients. The goal of a phase two trial is, okay, we have this drug or combination of drugs that we know is safe and we can manage the side effects, but does it really work the way we had hoped? And so every phase two trial has different goals or outcome measures. And so that trial is going to take another year or year and a half to 2 years to complete. And at the end of that phase two trial, if they have a treatment that is safe and effective, it can move to a phase three. This is where you have two groups of patients, one who gets whatever is the best available approved therapy, and you give another group of patients the new therapy. And what the researchers are doing here is saying, okay, is our new therapy as good, if not better, than what we've considered to be the gold standard? And if it is, it can move ahead to get FDA approval, and then it would be open and available to everyone. So there are many more phase one and phase two trials than there are phase three. As I mentioned, simply because they don't get enough patients, sometimes they close, but obviously not every treatment is going to make it through all of these phases. Um, a phase four trial, I'll just briefly say, this is a trial where something's already FDA approved, but there's a group of patients that they're monitoring to see long term side effects and long term impact down the road. Next slide, please. So, I mentioned to you that wanting to enroll in a clinical trial is not a straight path. There are many, many bumps in the road, and we can really put them into two buckets. There are patient barriers and physician barriers. So, just to go over a few. For patient barriers, as I mentioned, finances and health insurance coverage are really critical for clinical trial participation. But there are other financial costs associated with participating in a trial. For instance, if it's taking you away from home frequently or for an extended period of time, there's food, there's lodging, there's other associated costs that are important to consider. Sometimes we can help people get coverage for some of that through different resources, and sometimes trial sponsors are able to give some financial reimbursement for things like that, but it's important to consider. The location of trials. So, most clinical trials are happening at the large academic cancer centers with regards to cancer clinical trials. So, that means, for folks who do not live in those areas, and particularly for patients who live in rural areas, it can be very difficult to find a clinical trial that's reasonable or feasible to get to. There's also a lack of awareness about clinical trials. And so, that is because they're not being talked about early enough in treatment. But also, as I mentioned, there's so much stigma related to clinical trials. And so, that's one roadblock. And then trying to figure out what clinical trial you might be eligible for is really difficult as well. Um, and so that's the complexity of access. Being able to find a clinical trial, figure out if you're eligible for it, and then figure out how to be able to get to and from it can be really challenging. The other thing to consider is that clinical trials have really strict inclusion exclusion criterion. So, that makes it difficult for patients who have had a prior cancer or who have a current second cancer or have lots of different comorbidities. It can be challenging to find a trial that someone's eligible for. And there's really been a call to action about this to try to, make it less difficult to find a trial for someone to be eligible for. Um, but it still remains a challenge. When we think about the physician barriers, it is very time consuming work to figure out what trials are available for a patient. And some, healthcare providers simply don't have the time and resources to be able to figure that out. And it's a very realistic challenge. Um, that it takes a lot of time to do that research. And if you don't have clinical trials in your own institution, it's even more challenging. Um, there's also, the challenge that clinical trials aren't being talked about early enough or at all in some instances. So, my goal would be to have clinical trials discussed at diagnosis and in every change in treatment. Even if that's not what the patient and the team decide is the best next step for a patient, it will help us decrease the stigma about clinical trials and increase the awareness that they exist for all different stages of disease. And there is a challenge that some providers are afraid of losing their patients when the patient leaves them to go to a clinical trial, and that is, sometimes there's, financial challenges related to that. Other times it's not knowing that you can still definitely care for that patient, although they're in a clinical trial, but it just may look a little bit different. Next page, slide, please. Thank you. So I love this picture. So this picture shows you just how difficult it is to figure out what clinical trials someone may be eligible for. And really quickly, if you consider all of those pills at the top, all of the clinical trials for a particular diagnosis, and let's use multiple myeloma since I know there was a panel discussion before about this. And you start to factor in all those variables I've been talking to you about. So the patient's diagnosis, um, things like markers and mutations and prior lines of therapy and comorbidities and their ability to travel. You factor in all of that, and at the end of the day, there may be only a couple of trials that someone may be potentially eligible for. And so that's really hard to figure out. Next slide. And that's why my department really was created to help blood cancer patients in particular identify what trials they may be eligible for and then overcome those barriers to enrollment. And so, very quickly, we do this in a unique model. I have a team of 10 nurse navigators who have expertise in pediatric and adult blood cancer treatment. I have a Spanish speaking nurse navigator as well. And that a dedicated nurse is going to work with that patient, family member, or healthcare provider to help get to really know the person, understand what their available treatment options are, provide education, do the deep dive into the clinical trials, taking into account all those factors I mentioned, and really coming up with a list of potential options that people can take back to their provider or to a second opinion to determine what is the best next step. And then that nurse is going to be with that patient to help overcome the barriers to whatever that next treatment may be. Whether it's a clinical trial, whether it's pursuing standard of care, going on transplant, or helping someone get something through off label or compassionate use, even. So, um, if you have a blood cancer, or you know someone with a blood cancer who could use some help in navigating this really complicated journey to finding a clinical trial, please, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can see we have a 1-8 number here, 1-800 number, 1-800-955-4572. That's going to connect you to our information resource center at LLS, which is staffed by amazing master's prepared social workers, health educators, and nurses, and they can connect you with my department, or you can complete an online referral form as well. And I'll be sure that a nurse navigator reaches out to you and helps you throughout your journey. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you today, but I am more happy to have you hear from Mel, because he's the best example of clinical trial success.
Yeah, and I'm excited to speak to Mel as well. But I think some key points that I was really interested in, and I thought I knew more about clinical trials, but that's something that really sparked my interest was, number one, uh, you before you even get to phase one, it's got to go through different, and it's got to get approved to even to get to phase one of a clinical trial.
Mhm.
And so I think that's important. I think people miss that. And I'm thinking about, and I think people were really kind of introduced to clinical trials during COVID,
Mhm.
and that is not the way a typical clinical trial plays out. So kind of help people understand the way it's traditionally done and what happened, the differences with COVID, even though there were no shortcuts taken with COVID, just explain how that was done faster.
Yeah. You know what, Ellis? I think the biggest thing that we can take away from the COVID vaccine clinical trials is that they never had any trouble recruiting patients. So for many clinical trials, it takes so long to get enough patients to be able to move from phase to phase. That was not an obstacle with the vaccine clinical trials. So that's really why those trials were able to move through those phases so quickly, because again, there were no shortcuts at all, but simply getting the large number of participants helped to move it along quickly.
Absolutely, absolutely. So stick around. I'm sure there's some more questions that we're going to have for you, but so just hang out. But we got to get to Mel because I think
Yes.
we want to get to his story. So moving on, and our next guest is Mr. Mel Mann, and then like as I mentioned earlier, we're celebrating Men's Health today, and clinical trials are specifically designed to improve quality of treatment and health outcomes. As part of today's panel, we wanted you to meet a real world example of how clinical trials can improve quality of life, and that is in the physical form of Mr. Mel Mann. Mel was diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia in January 1995 and given just 3 years to live. 1995, 3 years to live. Here we are in 2022, and he's telling his story. Why is that? Well, the only possible hope for survival was a bone marrow transplant. Despite numerous marrow drives and adding thousands of people to the marrow registry, he never found a donor. 3 years after diagnosis, he entered the phase one clinical trial of Gleevec at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Over 20 years later, he is the world's longest living Gleevec patient. So, welcome to the program, Mel.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks for having me.
So, if you don't mind, take us back to before you were diagnosed with leukemia. Did you know or feel something wasn't right, or were you caught off guard by that?
Well, back in 1995, actually 1994, when I started noticing some symptoms that I didn't know were symptoms, is that my back was hurting really, really bad. And also I had a lot of fatigue. So I went to the doctor and they did their test. But I was a major. I was living up in Michigan with my wife and our 5-year-old daughter. And yes, it did catch me off guard because when the doctor gave me the news, it sounded I heard this ticking sound, and I was trying to. It was like a big drum, and I was trying to figure out where it was coming from. And I looked up on the wall, It was a clock that the second hand was ticking. And, I was in shock. The doctor's words were just coming in and out. And that's where I realized what shock really feels like.
Right. Wow. And did you know anything about leukemia when you were first diagnosed? I mean,
very, very little. And, I knew, I thought mainly it affected mostly kids. And I didn't know there were so many different types. And, I didn't know. I just knew it was bad. And there were not a lot of resources back in 1995. There's really no internet to go look on.
Right. And you think about like 95. Yeah, I'm old enough to know the world before the internet, so I feel you on that one. There was a lot of resources there.
Yes.
So I guess how did you learn about the clinical trial at the MD Anderson Center?
Okay, so what happened was, I was doing all the bone marrow drives, and the reason they weren't successful is African Americans, blacks had a 1% chance of finding a match. And when I was diagnosed, it was like 2,000 blacks needed a match every year. Maybe 8 of them found a donor, and the rest of them, they didn't have a good outcome. And I would not have had a good outcome had I not been on a clinical trial. And so what happened? I was doing I was living in Michigan, and we moved down to Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm at now. And I was doing a bunch of drives down here, and my wife's aunt was putting on a drive in Columbus, Georgia. So we drove down there, and when I got to the drive, they was told that this gentleman, this businessman, came to the drive. He was looking for me. He saw the promotions that we did on television, and I wasn't there, but he came back, and he said he had hairy cell leukemia. And he had been in a clinical trial. He said he had been near death, and he went out to MD Anderson, and they just turned his leukemia around. He was looking good, lean and mean, and so he gave me the information, and I called, and then I went out to MD Anderson. I talked with the doctor on the phone. He said, "Come on out." And when I arrived in MD Anderson, the doctor said, I'm gonna, increase your dose, whatever you're doing, try different drugs, and then I'm gonna put you on clinical trial after clinical trial. And that's how I started with clinical trials. And around the 3-year mark, I was still at the same place I was at the 1-year mark. And so I asked the doctor, was there anything else that, any other drugs? And he said, well, there's this one drug, but we're having problems in the lab in animals. But if we ever get approval by the FDA to use it, you'll be the first person to use it. And then, his nurse, who was an African-American nurse, said, you just told somebody else that. So he said, okay, you'll be number 2, because you could only put 20 people on it.
Right.
Okay. So it was a very small trial, 20 people in 3 different sites. So I went home, and then about maybe 7 months later, I got a call, and the doctor said, come on out. We got approval to use it in humans. And it started working for me. It did not work for the first guy who was on it at MD Anderson, but it worked for me. And about 10 months later, I was able to run a 26.2 mile marathon in Alaska.
Oh, wow. So you're like, I'm just going to go straight to a marathon. Okay.
Right. Yeah. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, they had contacted me because I had to stay out at the MD Anderson for 3 months for the trial. And then I had to keep going back every 90 days for like 3 years. Now, the drug was not approved, until like 3 years after I was doing a lot of stuff by the 3-year mark, but it was not approved at 3 years later. 2 years after the marathon, and I did like a Century 111 mile bike ride up in down in Tucson, Arizona. So I was doing a lot, but it was only because of the clinical trial. And the people who were not on the clinical trial, who did not have access to the drug, they were not doing well.
Wow. So, it's interesting. Like when I was reading your story, like I didn't realize you had participated in multiple clinical trials.
Oh, yes. I had been out there Oh, well, I started going out to MD Anderson. When I started going out, I kept going like every 2 to 3 months, and they would put me on like a trial for like a month. For example, a peg interferon. It was not really to extend my life; it was to make my quality of life better, because I had to take a shot every day. So they said, well, we can see if we can get you to take a shot once a week, which make it easier,
Right.
less pain. And then I had to keep this stuff refrigerated, so it was like a ball and chain I had to carry with me all the time. But if I could just do it once a week, it was fine. So I tried that, but that didn't work either. So drug by drug. But the good thing about that was it kept me in the game long enough to try something new.
Yeah. You had to. I mean, if you're only given 3 years to live, and then you're talking about these, it seems like these clinical trials, even though they weren't as effective as the last one,
Yes.
it still got you to get to that last one, which was the most effective.
Right. And I knew what the current treatment was, and that wasn't going to cut it. I was not responding to that treatment.
Okay. So, I mean, so it seemed like you were really just okay with the whole clinical trials process and getting into it, and just you're adventurous. I mean, because I think some people hear clinical trials and they recoil a little bit.
Yeah. See, the big problem there was I was not asked until the 18-month mark. And, as far as being okay with it, I think the number one thing is you have to ask somebody first, and not have like assume, well, he's not going to be compliant, or he's like, he's heard about Tuskegee, so I'm not even going to ask him. He's heard about Dr. Sims with the enslaved women. He's heard about with the Henrietta Lacks. He's heard all this stuff. But I can do the calculation myself and say, what are my chances? What are my chances if I take this treatment versus this other treatment? And I can make the decision myself.
Okay. I think it's a really good point. First of all, you sound very educated about everything that's happened. And we understand that is part of that distrust that many Black Americans have with healthcare, and particularly with clinical trials. However, you're faced with a situation is, if I don't get involved, what's my potential outcome and rate of survival? And so, you waited and you made your own decision. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Last question is, okay, so you went from clinical trials participant to survivor, and now you're an advocate. Talk to me about how that transition process evolved for you. How did you go through that process? Not only, mentally as well, it just getting through and now being here on the other side as an advocate.
Well, I felt I had to be an advocate from day one, and because my sister did not match me on the marrow for a marrow donor, no one on the registry matched me, so I got with the marrow registry, different ones, the military and civilian, and I told them I wanted to do bone marrow drives, and they said, well, it'd be better off if somebody else does these for you, because they're very strenuous and they take a lot out of you. But I felt that I could get more empathy and a better response from people if they saw me out there, because I think you have to create a response in people to make them react. And telling my story, going out to the churches, taking my daughter, who was 5 years old at the time, and now she's a physician herself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And and during that time, a lot has happened. But just showing that I'm like you, and I could be your brother, I could be your son, I could be your husband, and just explaining the blood diseases, and explaining the value of research, the value of community, and the value of just getting involved. So that we all can make a difference. And as far as clinical trials, it's also one of the benefits too, is that it gives us a chance to be involved and make a difference. Because we're pioneers, so we're trying it out for the other folks. So with my disease, there are like 350,000 people that have benefited from Gleevec, and then there are other cancers that have benefited from Gleevec. So the influence is really, really broad. And It was the first targeted drug of its kind.
Well, I would say on behalf of Black Doctor and our audience, we're very happy that you had a positive result. We're very happy that you're here, and I think that your advocacy is going to get more people to be on that registry, especially more Black Americans to be on that registry. We understand that. We've worked with the Red Cross and talk about blood donation as well in terms of getting more Black folks involved in donating blood. And so I think it's important for us to recognize not only that it saves lives, and
Right.
and you're more likely to have a match from even though as humans we're all compatible, you're more likely to have a match for somebody that is from
Yeah,
the same.
that's a good point. Yes.
And I think that's really important for people to recognize. And so if you're not in the registry, then it could really literally cost somebody their life. And so we have to make sure that we're there helping our fellow man. So, man, just thank you. Hang around. We've got some more questions for you, but we're going to get to our next guest here, and that is Dr. Bernice Coleman. Sorry. Dr. Coleman is she has good morning. She's got the alphabet soup after her name, so I wouldn't.
So don't get crazy with it.
Yeah. But she has over 35 years of advanced practice nursing experience in the cardiac surgical care, ventricular assisted devices, and transplantation. Dr. Coleman has paired her clinical practice with a research career focused on health disparities. Her research spans bench to bedside to community with work on genomic transplant disparities, family caregivers, and church-based preventive blood pressure education. She is the director of nursing research for Cedars-Sinai Health System. Her scientific and professional contributions have led to membership on the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Advisory Committee to Organ Transplantation, member of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on a fair and more equitable, cost-effective and transplant system of donor organ procurement, allocation, and distribution, chair of the Genomic Nursing and Healthcare Expert Panel for the Academy of Nursing. She's a national mentor, National Associate of Ethnic Minority Nurses, and Advisory Council, UC Davis, Betty Moore Nursing Innovation Fellowship. She was a member of the IRB for more than 15 years. Welcome to the program, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you for having me.
I guess my first question for you is, at the beginning of the program, I did a word association exercise by asking viewers what they think when they hear the word clinical trials. My first question to you is, what should people be thinking when they hear the words clinical trials?
So I think, in listening to the two speakers ahead of me, Leah did a wonderful job in explaining clinical trials. And Mel is walking proof of the outcome of clinical trials.
Yeah.
So people should be thinking that clinical trials are a way to do two things: potentially help me, but definitely help the greater good in helping care for patients around whatever it is the trial is focusing on. And Leah was very specific around the fact that trials have steps, right? They have phase 1 to phase 3, and there's very small sample sizes sometimes. So the trial itself is really focused on trying to understand one small entity. Now, it may be medications, then again, it could be also something clinical, the comparison of two clinical interventions. One may be new, the other may be traditional. So it's an opportunity to gain knowledge on how to best care for yourself, for which you may benefit, you may not. But again, the consent forms will tell you about that. But for sure, it's going to help the greater good from the perspective of how do we best manage a particular entity.
So are clinical trials just about creating medicines, or they're about other things as well?
That's a really good question. Their origin traditionally is about medicines, yeah. But in reality, they are really, um, think about them as a way to test if one thing is better than the other, meaning, is one intervention better than the other? Sometimes we do something called comparative effectiveness research, where we in fact know that two very good known interventions work. But we want to know, does it work specifically for this group under these conditions, or does it work for another group under those conditions?
Right.
So, yeah.
So, all right. So you've worked on a number of clinical trials. Can you give us like a real world example of a trial you worked on and the outcomes that trial had?
Sure. First of all, again, I give props to Leah. She did a great job, and it's a wonderful service of what the Leukemia Society is doing. And to Mel, who advocated for himself. So I'm a very strong proponent on helping people to advocate for themselves. We should not be waiting until we have a disease to feel like we should advocate for ourselves. So I work primarily inside of a large medical center with patients that have end-stage heart disease. Not everybody is going to get a transplant. That's what we'd like, but some people actually are not eligible for transplants. My curious question was, what, why shouldn't we spend some time on prevention, right? Because the fundamental underpinnings for African Americans versus Caucasians, or Black versus white patients for developing end-stage disease can be different. And probably the most prevalent reason for end-stage disease in African Americans is hypertension.
Mm-hmm.
And hypertension doesn't hurt. So I don't know I have the problem. And maybe I checked my blood pressure and it was high, but then it was low too. So I don't know what that means. So what, right?
Right.
And so this silent disease, which is could be intervened upon and should be intervened upon before you get to end stage disease and all the dilemmas associated with that, is what motivated me to do some community-based research. And I did it in the church space. I was interested in hypertension prevention. And the way I did that, and when I say I, it's really a team of us that did it, was it first starts with myself and one of the community outreach people at Cedars-Sinai going to a church and speaking with the pastor. This is what we think we want to do. We want to really teach people about blood pressure, and we want to teach them a little bit about salt and the impact on blood pressure. We got buy-in from the minister. We told him what we wanted to do, which was we wanted to create a virtual reality intervention, but also couple that with education, which is one of the fortes that we do in the community,
Mm-hmm.
and with the intent of empowering the patients to become their own advocates, very much like what Mel talked about, very much like what Leah talked about. And he agreed, and we started off looking at foods. And so the plan was to have an evening meeting with congregants, and just for fun, what's your favorite foods? No shame, tell us what your favorite foods are. And it turns out the first meeting, the pastor came down later in the evening and noticed that there were no men there, it was only women. And he said, this is not going to work, because all that stuff they've got on the wall, that's not my fave. You got to have another one. So he brought the men in. So we ended up with two groups of folk men and women who put their best foot forward about their best foods. And then we had an odd number of people intentionally, so that we ended up with a consensus to come up with a number of special foods, and we put those foods into a VR set. And that was part of our intervention. The other part of the intervention was to provide education. And in order to do that, we also had a group of congregates who helped us define what they wanted education about. We gave them a list of things. We told them what we'd like to do, but we had them help design the intervention. And so by the time the study started, we had buy-in. The other part of the study was we intended to give them a Fitbit so they could watch how many steps they walked, and to teach them about blood pressure, teach them what is systolic, which is the top number, and how well the ventricle itself pumps blood forward up to the brain and out to the body and out to all the organs, and diastolic, which is how well the ventricles actually relax so that they can actually be fed through the coronary arteries. With hypertension, there is an inability of the muscle of the heart to do its job well, and the pressures after the vessels, in other words, after the heart, are very constricted. So the heart itself, you can imagine, gets big and has to pump harder, but then, like any other muscle, it can give out, right? So we gave a lot of education around that, and a number of topics that the congregates said they wanted to hear about from us. And we started the project. We started the project with IRB approval to recruit 40 people. We ended up recruiting 58. This was a feasibility study, which means it's a study that you can make changes as you go along. We're just trying to figure out, is it going to work? And the reason we went up, I had to go back to the IRB, was because people really enjoyed it, and each night they'd bring somebody else. And we could do that. So we ended up, by the time we started the study, with 58 people. The interesting thing to us was that when we asked the question, who's ever heard of a Fitbit, only 3 people raised their hands. They'd never heard of it.
Wow.
We also provided phones. Samsung helped us with that because we needed the VR to work for us. It was on the phone. It was a external device that you put on your phone. And we provided blood pressure cuffs, and we taught them how to check their blood pressure according to the procedures, getting up with a routine procedure to check it in the morning and in the evening. And I think certainly to our surprise, there were many surprises. We also had nurses call them twice a week just to check in, see how they were doing. There were many surprises. The first was that it was a 12-week program. Only in the female group, the women missed only 1 class, the men missed 2. So that was incredible engagement. We, as a research team, did not interfere with the plan between the participants and their doctor. What we did impact was empowering them to advocate for themselves, very much like what Mel spoke about, very much like what Leah spoke about, because it's that advocacy in the face of not death, but health. How about that for a switch?
Right.
That we really have to connect to make ourselves better. So we did that, and we let people sit wherever they wanted to sit. We did a number of measurements of blood pressure and belonging, etc. And in the beginning, people didn't know anybody, and they felt very disconnected. In the end, they felt very connected. What was interesting was everybody always went back to their same tables that they self-selected, which was interesting. What we learned as researchers was that you must establish trust, and they trusted us. We learned as teachers to close our mouths and listen more. So we cut down on the time that we had set for lecturing, and we had more time for sharing. How did you make it through the week? How did you work out your diet with less salt? What kinds of things did you use? What kind of strategies did you use? We hired a chef, and we had a meal that was done, low sodium meal, and everybody was completely surprised. So the cooks were like, "How did you do that?" We had
Right.
a demonstration, a cook demonstration as well. We had some exercise. All of these were things that the congregants said they wanted. So I think the take home here was go in, consider that when you are doing research in the community, you're stepping into somebody else's world, somebody else's house. Be respectful of that. Listen to them, and don't think you have the answers, because you don't. I think from our standpoint, our goal was to become partners with the community, and we were. Already have a long-standing history in the community, but for the purpose of the research, um, that was, I think, our secret sauce. And as we watched blood pressures decrease, both systolic and diastolic, systolic being the top number, diastolic being the super important one, because the ventricle itself gets fed during that time, and it relaxes. All of those numbers have implications for population. So this was a small study of 58. We intend to redo it, this time in other ethnic churches. And so, my take home here was that advocacy is the thing that's the most important. We need to advocate for our health before we get sick. We need to do all of those things which are preventative that help us to stay healthy, because our goal is to become a welderly, which is to be elderly, but to be well.
I like that. I'm gonna use that, Dr. Coleman. I'm gonna give you credit for it when I do say it again, but I'm gonna use that
Want to
later.
be a elderly.
I'm definitely going to use that. So I'm going to bring back Leah and Mel here to the discussion, and as we're coming near the end of this discussion about clinical trials and the importance of involvement in improving outcomes, right? Because Mel is a living example of being involved in clinical trials. Leah did a wonderful job of really kind of encapsulating both the positive and negatives, right? And so I think, Leah, I want to give you credit for that, because a lot of times when we have these discussions, everyone wants to give you all the positives, and there are some challenges that it comes to clinical trials. That Dr. Coleman gave a real world example of, not a medicine trial, but really something about an intervention, education intervention that helped impact blood pressure, because we're saying, okay, how can we get ahead of this before we have to get to clinical trials, designing better medications to treat blood pressure? We could get in ahead of time. I guess so. My question for all of you, and anybody can jump in, is what do you think it would take to have more Black Americans become involved with clinical trials? And I know that's it's a heavy question. It's probably a whole conversation about it, but just kind of what are some of the things that we can do to get more Black people involved in clinical trials?
Okay.
I was just going to say, I loved what Dr. Coleman said about building trust. And so that, requires continued education, continued discussion about clinical trials as an option to build trust in the system and trust between providers and patients. So that's a huge point.
And also, I think we have to look at the whole picture, because when we talk about involving African Americans in clinical trials, or a lot of times we're talking after the trial has already began. But I think the focus, a big part of the focus should be when there is a new drug or possibility of a new drug, and it shows response to some illness. Then the researcher has to me, an obligation, a social responsibility to say, how does this drug affect the all communities, not just Black communities, but all communities that may be affected by this drug, and what can I do to get everyone access to this drug? And there's so many different things, and you have to look at the social determinants of health.
Mm-hmm.
There's environmental concerns, there's food deserts, there's lack of transportation to this. So we have to increase accessibility also for the people who work along this stream of clinical trials, researchers and people who are involved in the process. And in addition, we have to bring the clinical trials closer to the patient. So we can bring the drug closer, we can bring the lab closer, we can bring everything closer and cut out that cost of traveling from Atlanta to Houston every 90 days. We have to get to the young people and get them interested in the scientific education so that they will say, hey, I want to go into this clinical trial process. We have to loosen the exclusion criteria so we can get more folks in, take a closer look at that. And also, it's everybody's involved, even the people we talk to, and we go out to the churches, they have to be more open. And the gatekeepers at certain places have to understand that we're on an important mission of life-saving. It's a life-saving effort, and it's all going to help. Social disparities affect everyone.
And I would say that the providers have to have literacy.
Yes.
They really have to be very aware of their own biases.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to, to Leah's point, she brought up a very important point. We see this always in hub and spoke, which means if you happen to be, we are a hospital that is in the center and people refer to us from everywhere, so hub and spoke. When you have when your patient hits an end stage place and you need to transfer them to another facility that has different options, then the primary doc may feel like, oh, I'm losing my patient, which is, of course, one of the things that Leah mentioned. We need to get over that. We need to get real focused, that keep the patient focused. And providers really are patient focused, but there's so much noise in the delivery of care that things get mixed up, right? So the counter to that is advocacy. We as individuals must advocate for our health, period. End. Not our disease, because we'll do that. That's a hot poker. But our health, which feels fine, and you just go about your business and you take it for granted. So if we have a patient that's advocating for itself, provider that is literate and keeping the patient centered, and all of the supports like the Leukemia Association and other associations. Also, let's not forget about the National Institutes of Health. There's a clinical center that has a number of clinical trials that are there, that you come to the clinical center and that's not costing you anything. All the care is taken care of. And to be resourceful. We are not in 95 anymore, 1995, right? We're in 22. So there's many ways that we can reach out for help. We may not have the answer, but there's so many options to do that. So I think that on the side of the provider, we have our role, and on the side of the patient, they have their role. And I think that synergy helps us to get this message out. And that itself, when we get in sync in that way, you will see trust bloom and we'll see health get better, along with systems. But as you said, it's loaded and we could go on forever. About this.
Well, as we're coming to the close, I want to make sure to give people some resources that they can, if they want to learn more about clinical trials, if they want to get involved in clinical trials. What are some of the resources? I know there's clinicaltrials.gov. Yep. So I did put that in the comment section, and I'll put that on the screen for people too. So, and it's got all of them in there. So it's got medical trials. It's got like what Dr. Coleman talked about. There are all the trials there. You can submit to them and see if you're a match for those trials that are available, and there's some available in your area. So are there any other resources? I know, Leah, you mentioned that for bloodborne illnesses, you've got a whole team there willing to, and really the beautiful thing about her team is they're going to screen you. They know about all the clinical trials that are available to you, and so you just call that 800 number and they'll take care of it. But that's only for bloodborne illnesses, so you got to make sure. So it's a limited amount, but they're LLS, so that's what they focus on. So any other resources that are available to people in our community that they can tap into?
The clinical center, NIH.gov. Clinical Center. We'll have all kinds of cutting edge clinical trials. The last thing I want to say is the question that you opened with for Leah, which was, how does this happen around COVID? How did COVID move so fast, right? It did move fast because it was easy to find people to get into studies, but it moved fast because the science was already done. It was just waiting because people were already knowing that a pandemic was going to come because pandemics have come in the past. And the mRNA vaccine type approach was one that was already on the books.
I'd like to make one closing statement too. As far as with African Americans, I think the biggest thing is inviting them to the clinical trial table. And, with the event of a lot of electronic conversion of the records or whatever, you can have some type of artificial means of just triggering when the person has a disease, that person be asked about certain, be told and informed about clinical trials. So you have to build all this stuff in and take the bias out of the provider, because he's going to have, or she, it doesn't matter, they could be the same race, but they're going to have bias about a particular patient. So you have to remove that.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I think what we know today is we've got a better understanding from Leah about clinical trials and what the process entails. We've got a real world example with Mel, and two types of real world examples from Dr. Coleman as well, and from Mel. But I think we understand this is a multifaceted approach that we have to take. There's not a silver bullet, there's not a magic pill that we can get better. We have to view it from all angles and try to approach it from all angles. But what we all can agree on is that clinical trials save lives and they improve outcomes. And so the more that we can get involved as a community, the better our outcomes, the better medications, the better treatment interventions that will be developed, and the more lives that will be saved, whether now or in the future. And so we want to make sure that we are getting involved and staying involved so we can improve outcomes for health today and tomorrow. So again, I want to thank our guests. I want to thank our partners at LLS for helping us put on this wonderful panel. This is number 2. We've got 3 more to go, but it's going to be later on this evening. So take a break, get you some lunch, whatever time of day it is for you. But later on this evening, we're going to be talking about men's sexual health, right? So we're going to talk about sexual health in men. We're also going to be talking about losing that gut. You got to lose that gut, and the impacts that having too much belly fat can have on your overall health. And then finally, we're going to have a panel with our friends at Cedars-Sinai Hospital on pancreatic cancer. So we're really going to have a wonderful, wonderful panel today, but that's starting at 6 p.m. Eastern time here on blackdoctor.org, Facebook Live. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we will see you later on this evening as part of our Men's Health Summit.